This series is itself part of a larger initiative called the Jewish Philanthropy Research Initiative. The purpose of that larger initiative is to promote new research in the study of Jewish philanthropy and broader understanding of all the different dimensions of Jewish philanthropy as a part of Jewish life. That effort is part of a collaboration between the Katz Center and the Feinstein Center for American Jewish History at Temple University, directed by Professor Lila Corwin-Berman, and I'm very thankful to Lila for her partnership and to the Lippman Kampfer Foundation for Living Torah for its co-sponsorship of this series. Before I introduce our speaker, allow me just to share a little bit of information about how things are going to work. The whole program is going to run for 1 hour. The presentation part will run for about 30 to 35 minutes, which will give us plenty of time for discussion and questions afterwards. So we hope you'll use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. And I will be reading those on your behalf or paraphrasing them on your behalf for a kind of discussion with our speaker in the last 20 or so minutes of the presentation. Finally, let me just smuggle in a plug for the next talk in this series, which won't be until February 8th. So it'll be a little bit of time from now, but it'll be a great talk in and of itself with Professor Joseph Sassoon, who has just published a very, very rich and fascinating and truly global history of the Sassoon family that has garnered a lot of attention and very positive press. So we're very excited about that. But today, it is my pleasure now to introduce our speaker to you, Professor Debra Kaplan. Professor Kaplan is a social historian focused on Jewish life in early modern Europe. She completed her PhD here at Penn and is now associate professor at Bar-Ilan University in its Department of Jewish History. So she is coming to us from Israel today. Professor Kaplan's first book was a study of Jews and Christians in the city of Strasbourg in the era of the Reformation, and it was a great achievement, garnering many, many prizes. But the reason we wanted her to share some of her research with you today is because of her most recent book, which is entitled The Patrons and Their Poor, Jewish Community and Public Charity in Early Modern Germany, which was recently published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. And in her presentation today, she's going to be drawing on that work in ways that I think will help us understand some of the differences between early modern Jewish charity and contemporary Jewish philanthropy. So with that, it is my pleasure now to hand over the virtual stage to Professor Kaplan.
Thank you so much, Steve and Lila, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'd like to start my presentation with a somewhat provocative text, one of the most unusual texts that I consulted in the course of writing my book. Now, I'm speaking about a Yiddish song published in 1708 that was written from the perspective of a poor Jew, a transient who sought to enter the Jewish community of Frankfurt in order to receive shelter and care. It's quite unusual to hear the voice of the poor in pre-modern historical records, and certainly in Jewish ones, because some poor people were, of course, illiterate and others had no time, luxury, or resources to write. Before I delve into the research and the text of the song itself, I just want to say a few words of background in order to usher us into the early modern period. And my work dealt with a period from approximately 1500 to 1750 in German lands. And in that time, the Jews in Frankfurt, and you see the map here from about 1628, lived in what we call the Judengasse, which is a small curved street. You'll see it in a moment, popping up on the other side. That's a zoom in of the map, which is on the right side of your map. The Judengasse was basically a confined ghetto. It was 330 meters long and between 4 and 6 meters wide. So it's a pretty cramped space. And by the 18th century, we have about 3,000 Jews living in this one street. The city of Frankfurt, like other German cities during this period, adopted strict rules prohibiting begging. So if you can imagine that the local Jews are already marginalized by being forced to live on this one street on the side of the city, which was open during the day and locked at night, and you can see the blue arrows on the slide are showing you where the gates would be that would be open in the day, but then locked at night, and those gates are very important for our poem. There was a suspicion towards foreigners and poor more generally that the city was certainly not inclined to allow any Jewish foreign poor into its walls. The Jewish community administered poor relief to its own poor, but its leaders were in direct contact with Christian municipal officials, and so this municipal policy fell on the Jewish community as well. When Jews from outside did try to come to Frankfurt, they were directed to the Judengasse, where a guard named Jakob Fulwasser was stationed at one of the gates. He allowed some travelers in for a brief stay and likely turned many others away. Now, in general, in the early modern period, slips of paper were used and they were like vouchers permitting Jews to remain overnight in the city, and they were issues to those who were permitted to enter. If you see on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see a printout, a pre-printed sheet of passes indicating that a Jew had paid the night tax to be able to stay overnight if he was a foreigner in the city. And on the right, you see one of the vouchers for meals. This would be a meal, this is from the city of Fürth, which would be a meal that a Jew could use to dine at the hospice that housed the poor and also the ill in the city. These small slips of paper were essential for separating between those poor that the guard deemed worthy of aid and those whom he turned away. Now back to our song. The song is written from the perspective not of the guard, but of the poor person attempting to enter the city for aid. And from that perspective, the guard Fulwasser was nothing less than a tyrant. And here's the beginning of the song translated into English. When we poor guests march to Frankfurt, people do not allow us to stay at their doors. Here comes Jakob Fulwasser with his cane to hustle us away and lead us one by one into the guardhouse. When we enter the guardhouse, the communal charity beadles open the book, and Jakob Fulwasser accompanies them. He asks, "How long have you been here, and what is your name?" The song continues to very painfully describe the life of the poor and how they were exposed to the elements, and I'll bring just one more example. In the winter, Fulwasser, does much worse, treating the poor cruelly. He leaves us, large and small, to stand in front of the gate and allows no one to approach the charity collectors until our hands and legs have frozen. We cry out in pain, "Dear God, why is it so cold for us?" This song provides us with the perspective of the poor individual who sought refuge and charity from Frankfurt's Jewish community and found the residents, to say the least, inhospitable. In my book, I juxtapose this unique perspective with that of the Jewish communal leaders as documented in communal logbooks. Those records, not surprisingly, tell a very different story. Lay leaders of Jewish communities in this period faced a constant dilemma of how to stretch their budget to cover more expenses than they could pay for. They had to pay taxes to the Christian government, physically maintain Jewish institutions, support the local poor, and try to support whatever foreign poor they could. And all of this was happening in a climate in which there was great suspicion toward the unemployed poor. When we read these different types of sources together, we see a complex reality that is not so different from some of the challenges facing contemporary Jewish communities. How do philanthropists prioritize causes to support? And from the point of view of the leadership, how do you try to increase the amount available in the charity fund? I'd like to briefly discuss each of these two questions from the vantage point of early modern Jewish communities. Part of what makes this an exciting topic is that it was during this period that official institutions of public charity became formalized in Europe among Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. There was some organized charity in Jewish communities in the Middle Ages, but it was really during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries that communities developed robust infrastructure to care for the poor, which was mirrored across communities. They built institutions such as hospices to house traveling poor and the mentally and physically disabled. They appointed formal charity collectors who oversaw different funds, funds for the local poor, funds for Torah study, and funds for the poor of the Holy Land. Individuals also founded pious confraternities that dowered poor brides, supported poor students, and cared for the sick and dying. And all of this, both policies and expenditures, was meticulously documented in logbooks, many of which have survived in communal and municipal archives, and they form the bulk of the sources that I was able to use in this research. Let's dive into some of the details by looking at the individuals who were tasked with overseeing charity, the Gaba'it Staka, the charity collectors. Every Jewish community appointed 2 or 3 charity collectors, depending on the size of the community. They were chosen from among the communal elite because when there was a shortfall in funds, and as you will see very shortly, there often was, the charity collector was expected to make that up from his own pocket. The charity collectors had several different jobs. First, they were responsible for distributing the money that had been collected for the poor, and they had discretion to make decisions as to whom among the poor would receive how much support. Now, that said, they were expected to maintain copious records of all of the income that came into the funds and of all of their expenses. And this is just one example of a logbook. I'll delve into this page in a few moments, but you can just see very neat lines. This is just 1 week of expenditures by the charity collector of Worms in 1737. Now, aside from these logbooks, they also issued receipts to donors. And here's some examples. Above the text that I put on the slide, you can see a charity receipt issued for charity to the poor of the Holy Land. And on the sort of selection that I have here, photographed in the Hamburg archive, are little tiny slips of paper that each one is a receipt for charity paid to the community charity collector. And their books, moreover, aside from these receipts, aside from the logbooks themselves, were also audited. Here you see an audit at the last page of one of the logbooks. And the lay communal leaders who ran the community had very strict parameters prioritizing who was eligible for support, so they could check the discretionary decisions of the charity collector and make sure that more or less they conform to the decisions of the communal leadership. Most donations took place in the synagogue. First of all, there were coffers that were placed in both the women and men's synagogues, often at the entrance, and those who came to pray, which both men and women did daily, could slip coins into the collection. But the men who performed weekly honors at the synagogue, such as being called up to the Torah or other honors, were expected to make a donation in exchange for the honor they had received. The charity collector maintained a special book in some communities, and he wrote names down and payments down in these books, and you have a page for each person who was called for an honor, had his own page, and all of the honors were listed, including the payments made. If someone did not pay his pledge within a certain time frame, he was forbidden from receiving any additional honors in the synagogue. Women, too, donated in exchange for honors performed in the synagogue, although in early modern times, their place in the synagogue was extremely gendered and limited. They performed labor in the synagogue, sweeping its floors, bringing water from wells for hand washing, laundering and folding the mantles and bindings of the Torah, and making candles to light the space in the age before electricity. On the festival of Simchat Torah, women auctioned off these particular honors in exchange for a donation, much as men auctioned off the honors of being called to the Torah. Because the charity collector was so active in the synagogue, he was also responsible for the maintenance of this and other buildings. Thus, perhaps surprisingly, it was the charity collector that oversaw and paid for a window repair in the synagogue, and who ensured that there was enough wax to light candles necessary for prayer. I say that this may be surprising because in early modern times, there were also other communal funds and other communal officials. One might have assumed, therefore, that the cost of a window repair or of a guard to watch the cemetery would have been paid from the general communal fund rather than the charity funds. But this was not the case and points to an overlap between taxes and charity, which I will discuss a bit later on in my presentation. One more word about charity collectors. The charity collectors were all men, but their wives played very active and critical roles in the collecting and dispersing of charity, as did other women in the community. I already mentioned that there was a coffer in the women's sections of the synagogues. And in addition, in many synagogues, women, whether the wives of charity collectors or other women, went around the synagogue or the neighborhood and collected for various causes. In Altona, for example, I found a women's coffer intended to raise money for the poor women of the Holy Land, and it was money raised by women and donated only to women, specifically to widows and orphans. Women were also deeply involved in some of the material goods donated to charity, linens and towels used in the hospice, second and third-hand clothing collected and redistributed to the poor. These were all laundered and folded and distributed by women. One of the greatest challenges of being a charity collector was the fact that the fund always ran at a deficit. So let's take a quick look at that ledger of a charity collector, from Worms, one of the cities that I surveyed in the book, and this is that same page. And you see the income on the left and the expenses on the right. You don't have to read a word of Hebrew or a word of manuscripts to see that there's a lot more expenses than there is income. You can just eyeball it, and the entire logbook is like this, without exception. And each one of these two sets of facing pages is based on 1 week's worth of charitable income and expenses. And now, just to give you sort of a deeper dive into this, what we see here is actually really interesting. We have a quarterly report at the bottom of this page, and the income is 237 gulden, 8 batzen, and 12 pfennig. The expenses, 958 gulden, 14.5 batzen. So we see a deficit of over 721 gulden. And just to give you a sense, even what was donated to the coffer in the synagogue over a 4.5-month period, only again, it's 4.5 months because it's done quarterly by the Hebrew calendar, and this was a leap year. And this only came to 99 gulden, so much less than the deficit is what's collected in the synagogue over about a third of a year, if we think about that. Now, If we go back to the Frankfurt example that I started my talk with, this is one of the reasons that the transient Jews are turned away. There's just not enough money to pay for them. There's not enough money to pay for most of the expenses that we see. And this is why the charity collector had to be wealthy, because he often had to pay for that shortfall. Even with all the donations, it was, of course, hard for the charity collector to support the vast number of poor. There were local poor who had membership rights in the community. They were entitled to financial stipends, medical assistance, and caregivers whose salaries were paid for by the charity collectors. Sometimes circumstances in a given city led to increased poverty. Thus, in Frankfurt, for example, a fire raged through the Judengasse in 1711, destroying the entire neighborhood. And you can see here, if you compare it to the map that I showed earlier, the entire street is missing. 10 years later, another fire ravaged the still not reconstructed street. And to illustrate the kind of devastation that these fires brought on the community, let us consider the narrative of Moshe Reistarum, a prominent community member whose father-in-law was a very important rabbi in Frankfurt, so someone who was among the communal elite. And he writes this in the introduction to his father-in-law's book, which you see here, the title page of that book. It's one of the custom books of Frankfurt. That itself was printed based on patronage and charity, because the son-in-law, as you see in a moment when I read this text, really had nothing at all. Now the tables have turned, and the hand of God was upon me and our community twice. In 1711, our entire community was burned down, and my house was also among them, and all my property and treasures, and almost nothing was left. And my house has not been rebuilt until today. Calamity followed calamity, and tragedy followed tragedy. The members of our community came to the brink of despair. In 1721, half our community was burned, and I was left literally naked, without clothing, bereft of everything. I even lacked 3 daily meals. The people of our community are merciful, the sons of merciful people, and doers of mercy, and they graced me and were of aid and assistance to me with their bodies and with their money to support me and my family and to dower my 2 daughters with substantial gifts. Now, the archival records that I worked with demonstrate that 2 years after the first fire, 28% of the Jewish community needed financial assistance from the charity fund. In years like that, the community could barely support its own members, and it gives us a really different perspective of what a Jewish community would have been like. Now, beyond responsibility to its members, the community also supported the laboring poor men and women who lived in the Jewish community, but who were unable to acquire the official right of membership. Now, it's really important to understand what I mean by the official right of communal membership, because unlike modern times, membership in German Jewish communities was highly controlled privilege. Not only did community leaders need to ensure that new members could pay taxes and not simply burden budgets that were already stretched quite thin, but Christian authorities needed to approve one's membership in the Jewish community. And they often sought to limit the number of Jews, whether through a quota system or another system. So for example, in Frankfurt, which we've been talking about, by law, only 6 Jews could acquire membership per year, and their membership would be approved by not just the Jewish community leaders, but also by the Christian municipal government. There were other, however, Jewish residents who could live for decades in the community without membership rights. So residence is not limited to members, but not all residents are granted membership. For example, Jakob Fulvasser, the guard whom I mentioned earlier, was one of these community residents who had no membership. And I found him in the community records here as one of the guards, and he lived in this house here where you see the blue arrow on the slideshow. He lived there for 30 years, and he served as a communal employee, yet he never acquired rights of membership. Residents like Yaakov were second in line to receive funding. Another prominent example of these local poor, residential poor, who yet were not official communal members, are Jewish maidservants who were employed as nannies, cooks, laundresses in Jewish communities, working to earn money for their dowries. So for example, in the Jewish community in Altona, and you can see this here in the next slide, charity collectors gave an extra stipend to maidservants who became engaged to be married and who had worked in the community for at least 3 years. And the numbers that you see is a stipend and marks that each one of the maidservants received upon her betrothal. If the local poor were the highest on the priority list, and next came the residential poor who were not members, the very last on the list were the transient foreigners with whom I started my talk. As I mentioned, the charity collector had a great deal of discretion in dispersing money. We see many such Jews admitted in and then sent on with enough money or food to get them to the next community. We also see, however, that the charity collectors did tend to support mothers and young children, particularly poor pregnant or birthing mothers, supplying them with food, lodging, delivery of the baby, and postpartum care for 2 weeks. We see then that communities developed a hierarchy of the poor, prioritizing their limited budget to support first the local poor, then the residential poor, those who lived in the community but were not members, and last, the foreign poor, with women and children receiving more support than young men. And of course, this matches also with the cultural suspicions of young unemployed men that I mentioned earlier. Now, all of this picture that I've given so far is just regarding the poor who physically turned up in the community. There were also permanent special funds for the poor of the Holy Land, as well as ad hoc support raised for other communities in times of crisis, such as fire or persecution or libel. Beyond support for the poor, running a Jewish community in early modern Europe was very expensive. Larger urban Jewish communities such as Frankfurt, Altona, Hamburg, Wandsbek, and Worms, the 3 communities that I surveyed in my book, maintained various institutions that required maintenance. Among them, the synagogue, the cemetery, ritual baths, the hospice, and courts. Communities employed a wide range of employees, a rabbi, at least one cantor, usually more in a big city, scribes, guards, caretakers for the hospice, firefighters, among others. Communal leaders were also responsible for ensuring that children, at least boys, were educated. In addition, they had to pay taxes, at times to more than one Christian authority. To manage communal affairs, administrators had to buy logbooks and pay scribes for recording ordinances. Sometimes documents required binding or notarized seals, which also cost money. As communities grew in size, and as poor refugees and migrants made their way to these communities, the costs only escalated. So given these many needs, how did the charity collectors fill the coffers beyond the gifts donated in synagogue, which we saw really didn't do much to help with the deficit? To answer this question, we have to understand that during the early modern period, certain categories of income, which we might separate today, were absolutely intertwined. These categories are charity, fines, and taxes. We tend to think of charity as a voluntary gift, whereas fines and taxes are mandatory. That said, the fact that modern nations recognize charity by providing a tax deduction for donations hints to a much more blurred relationship between these categories that was certainly present in earlier times. And I'll just bring a few examples of what I mean. Let's begin with fines. Early modern European societies were very interested in promulgating scores of rules and regulations to maintain social order and to ensure that everyone acted in a manner that was deemed honorable and respectable. And transgressors of these various rules and regulations were fined. What is fascinating is that in the Jewish community, these fines were often payments to the charity funds. In other words, if someone transgressed communal ordinances, he or she was required to make a donation to charity. For example, in April 1660, Seligman Kulp of Frankfurt was recorded as having mocked the lay leaders before the rabbinical court. He was told to atone for what he had done and was further punished by being denied any honors in the synagogue for the following 6 years. He was banned from eating any meals outside his home for 3 years. And most important for us, he was ordered to pay a very hefty sum of 25 Reichstaler to charity. So paying a fine to charity. Similarly, in 1628, Yaakov, a young man residing in the house of Shlomo Bon, humiliated Shlomo's virgin daughter, which is likely a euphemism for some sort of sexual contact that caused damage to her reputation. He was banned from receiving lodging in the community after the upcoming fair had ended. Anyone found granting him a place to sleep was not only to be shamed publicly, but was to pay 10 Reichstaler to charity, as well as 10 to the Christian authorities. And this dual fine was a means of enforcement. Once a perpetrator was on the hook for paying a fine to the crown or to the city, the community had more leverage over him and could ensure payment to the charity fund. Mandating donations as a penalty for transgression belies the notion that charity was solely a pious act. This punishment inverted the honor that one typically received as a donor. On the one hand, this charity was penance for wrongdoing and may therefore have been viewed as a means to redeem the perpetrator in theological terms. Yet it was also born of transgression rather than piety and was thus associated with shame rather than honor. In addition to the blurring of the lines between charity and fines, the lines between charity and taxes were also blurred. I mentioned earlier that the charity collector oversaw mundane synagogue repairs, which were paid for out of the charity funds and not the general community fund, which was managed by the Jewish tax collectors. Similarly, certain charitable funds were sometimes managed by the tax collectors. So not only were the personnel and budgets crossed, but there were also issues of mandatory charity. And I'll just bring a few examples. So in Frankfurt, it was decided in 1555 that whenever any couple would marry, each side of the wedding party had to donate to the community a quarter gulden from the dowry. Similarly, anyone who inherited money was instructed to pay a quarter gulden out of each 100 gulden that he or she had inherited, which is an effective tax rate of 0.25%. Such payments were used to support poor students. While the funds were intended to support the poor, the gift was not merely customary or socially expected. Rather, every family that married off a child was assessed this amount. It is something a modern reader would typically think of as a tax rather than a donation. But in early modern times, it's considered a donation, and it goes to support specific funds within the charitable infrastructure of the community. In Hamburg and Altona in 1732, families making a wedding party were required to hire an individual who worked in the hospice to serve at the party. Should they not wish to do so, they had to pay him nonetheless. Community members who held celebratory parties for a circumcision or a wedding were also required to rent utensils from those communal officials tasked with caring for the sick. So your money's going to care for the sick. And similarly, as the number of the poor in the triple community of Altona, Hamburg, Wandsbek increased, lay leaders ruled that upon the birth of a daughter, the parents were obligated to contact the charity collector within a week after the baby was born. And when the father was called to the Torah to name the newborn baby, he was also informed that he had to arrange payment for that honor. And this was something that was written down in the tax records. In each of these cases, the occasion of a family celebration obligated the family to support a specific sector of the poor by mandating the hiring of poor laborers, renting from the community, or donating money to poor students. These mandatory payments to charity were in some sense taxes on members of the community. They filled the coffers, granted the donors prestige and honor during life cycle events. How were these taxes to the charity funds enforced? Because unlike the fines where the Christian authorities were involved, these kinds of taxes did not involve the Christian authorities. Communal leaders did not grant permission for members of the community to marry off their young children until all debts, both to the tax collectors and the charity collectors, were paid off. The archives include bylaws instituting this policy, and they also include references to payments made and permission to marry granted. So we know that this was in fact a bylaw that was enforced. And this is just an example of one of the pages of the sexton, and also now with different permissions granted to people to marry off their children or to marry themselves. And I'll just give a few examples. Leib Botnam of Altona was permitted to betroth his daughter to Jacob on the condition that his debts were paid. An orphan girl in Altona was also instructed to pay off her own debt because she was an orphan of 40 Reichstaler before marrying her fiance. And a widow Yenta from Altona was obligated to pay 50 Reichstaler before announcing the betrothal of her daughter. We have seen so far that community leaders imposed taxes and fines which would be paid to the charity coffer as a means to increase revenue and cover expenses. They leveraged important life cycle events in order to do so. In addition to these strategies, they also drafted new regulations for synagogues, which were intended to increase donations. And I'll bring just a few examples. In some communities, it was forbidden to pray in smaller quorums, because then the men and women praying in a smaller quorum would not be present in the main synagogue and they would not donate to the main charity funds. In other communities, which were larger, the charity collectors went and taxed the men and women who prayed in smaller quorums to make up for those vital donations and make sure they would not be lost. Another strategy that I found in the records was limiting honors in the synagogue to married men, because these men could afford to pay for their honors, whereas younger men who were not yet married did not have the financial independence to pay, and so they were precluded from any synagogue honors. Synagogue services were therefore designed to maximize the possibility of donations. Another important source of revenue was the sale of synagogue seats. Synagogue seats in general were purchased by community members and could be passed on an inheritance or else sold to another buyer. But when a couple died childless, or if their heirs lived outside of the community seized the seat and resold it to the highest bidder with no regard to an heir living elsewhere, an heir that wasn't a child. Seats were a coveted form of real estate and could go for a very high price. And so this was a very important means of filling the charity fund. I will bring one final example that also typifies how communal regulations were enacted in order to ensure that the community could support itself and its poor. This regulation from Frankfurt brings us full circle, as it is a regulation that deals with refugees who came to the city. Now, refugees flocked to Frankfurt already in the 17th century, and those of you who were at Adam Teller's talk in this series undoubtedly heard about the Eastern European Jewish refugees who fled from the Cossack uprising and the Swedish wars to German cities. The influx of refugees continued both from the east and from neighboring areas in Germany that were struck with war and pillage throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. As I mentioned, these Jewish refugees could not easily acquire formal membership in the Jewish community. There was limited physical space. The municipal authorities strictly limited the number of Jews who could join the community, and even the number of Jewish couples who could marry. So you couldn't just marry a refugee and be accepted into the community. In 1743, we see a very interesting communal response to the quandary of how to accept refugees, manage the number of poor within the community, and ensure that the community could support itself. Jewish communal leaders decreed that refugees who wish to stay long-term, and they don't specify what long-term is, but you get a sense that it's more than the few days granted to the transient poor, probably at least months. And some of these refugees I found stayed for many, many years, some even decades. So these refugees who wished to stay long-term were expected to pay their obligations to the community before being permitted to celebrate family occasions in the synagogue. If any refugee had not paid at least 2/3 of the amount that he owed to the community, his son would not be permitted to read from the Torah in either the old or new synagogue on the occasion of his bar mitzvah. Those who had paid 2/3 of their debts could ask for permission from the leadership to celebrate publicly in the synagogue. So on the one hand, the community allowed the refugees to hold the celebration in the synagogue in the same way as communal members did. It also acknowledged their financial predicament to some degree by reducing the rate they were required to pay to 2/3 instead of the entire sum. So they give them a break on the price. But on the other hand, there was an expectation that those who settled more permanently in Frankfurt would contribute to communal taxes. And it goes without saying that not all refugees could pay these taxes. Some were expected to, or really forced to, move on. To conclude, we have seen that early modern Jewish communities had tremendous expenses. They had many people to care for and had many institutions to maintain. The leaders of these communities leveraged the power that they had to draft regulations and to impose fines and taxes that would help fill the charity coffer. We have seen that despite their best efforts, the demand for charity was greater than the supply. The charity collectors were forced to make difficult decisions about who to support and how much they should receive. Communal leaders devised hierarchy among the poor, prioritizing those who they felt most deserved the charity that was available. While the specific parameters of how early modern European Jews structured charity was deeply rooted in the culture of their communal life, I still believe that many of these challenges resonate today. Thank you.
Debra, thank you so much for that. That was a fascinating paper. In fact, Lila and I are feeling very vindicated in doing this series because it's really so important to call attention to the kind of research that you're doing. So thank you for sharing a little bit with us. I just want to remind the audience to use the Q&A function if they have questions, and I will read them out on their behalf. But I want to begin with a kind of conceptual methodological question that Lila herself has asked, and it has to do with the use of the term charity to describe what you have uncovered. Because, it sounds like a kind of social welfare system rather than, what a lot of us associate with the word of charity, of voluntaristic giving. So I'm wondering about, on Lila's behalf, how applicable that term is. Is that the right term to describe what's happening? Or conversely, and even more radically, should we be using a different word for contemporary behavior other than philanthropy or charity? Any thoughts you have about?
I think this is a really great question, and it's what sort of drove me to try to choose this material for my research to present in this forum. I definitely see a difference between modern philanthropy, or at least how I think of modern philanthropy, and the kind of charity that I'm talking about, which is absolutely an early modern social relief system, or the roots of the European welfare system really lie in the early modern period. And that is what I'm talking about. But this was how early modern people, Jews and Christians, Catholics, Protestants, this is how they saw charity. the question that we have, or the assumptions that we have about this voluntary giving, are not absent from the period in the sense that they're rooted in very traditional religious teachings about gift giving. But early modern Jews would have considered all of these donations to be charity, even when they were mandatory. And they use the word that we use for charity, tzedakah, to describe this. So for example, if someone is punished and you have, let's say, a young couple that's married and they have a baby several months right after their wedding, and this is something the community wants to punish, they basically say you need to donate, your punishment is a fine to the charity fund, and they use the word the charity fund. So it's not Debra coming and saying, I'm saying this is charity because it was used by the charity collector, but rather this is how these Jews saw charity. It was much more all-encompassing and much more intertwined with fines, with taxes than we would think today. And so I think that is a difference. Should we change the term for the modern period? I don't think we should use the term philanthropy for the early modern period. But I think the word charity shifts over time. And that's something I think is really, really important takeaway, especially from research in the early modern period, because it's so different than what comes before in the medieval period. And it's also different from what comes after, when the communities are disbanded and charity becomes voluntary, because there is no formal communal infrastructure. And so everything has to be voluntary. Even membership in the community is voluntary.
Very interesting. A quick follow-up question on that. I'm just interested, given that, it's the language of tzedakah, and there's a tradition that goes back to the, rabbinic sources and not earlier connected to that word. Are things like anonymity important? How much of let me focus on anonymity. Is that part of this culture? Do people know who's giving? How important it is to know who's doing the giving in this culture?
So, the ideal of giving anonymously appears already in medieval times, certainly earlier than that, but then also medieval times. And I wouldn't want to discount it as something important in the early modern period, but it's the kind of thing that I wouldn't see in the records that I consulted, because the records that I consulted are all about the tax collector and the charity collector, and they write down every detail. Just to give you an example, if a family gave charity and it was written down in the name of the head of the household, the father, but the mother was the one who came and brought the payments, or the daughter was the one who came and brought the payment, that's also written down in the logbook. So they're very, very, very careful about things like that. And a lot of things that are connected to public charity were very much recognized and tied to honors in the synagogue, honors in the community, receiving a blessing. And so this charity is less anonymous and much more about that sort of public ownership. If we think about naming a center or a hospital after a person, we have funds named after people. So the so-and-so fund, they left X amount of money in their will, and that money goes to the poor. That's not to say that there weren't individual Jews who gave anonymously. They might have, and certainly slipping money into the coffer itself would have been anonymous, but that's not the kind of material that I looked at for this project.
So let me turn now to some questions from our audience. And this one comes from Thomas, who, first of all, thanks you for a fascinating paper. I'm just going to read his question verbatim because I don't want to misrepresent it. I'm struck by the formal organizational similarities between Jewish and Christian charity in the early modern period. One distinction stands out in my mind and experience. Jewish overseers of charity seem to have kept much more detailed records. It is unusual, for example, for individual receipts of charity to survive in Christian charities. This leads Thomas to ask two questions. First, what kinds of contacts might have existed between these two charitable systems, Jewish and Christian, in Frankfurt? And second, assuming the contacts were minimal, how would you explain the striking similarities between the practices of charity?
Okay, so first I want to say hi to Tom Safely, who asked that question, who was my doctoral advisor. And I'm sure that Thomas is Tom. So hi, Tom. It's nice to hear you through the webinar format. I think that there were contexts between the two systems. In other words, I don't think that the Christian authorities were reading the Jewish books, which are in Hebrew and in Yiddish, but I think that some of the information was clearly being passed on to Christian authorities. For example, any fine that would have been half to charity and half to the Christian authorities would have been written down. I never found that in the municipal archives, but I assume that since those payments were forwarded to the Christian authorities, there was some kind of list forwarded along with them. So that's the first thing. And I think we have to think about Jewish communities as being not in a vacuum. Even in Frankfurt, where there's a Judengasse and the Jews are living on the side of a community or marginalized to some extent, they're very much still a part of that community. And so I think there are similar attitudes on the one hand towards charity, which are common to Jews and Christians, not only because they're rooted in some of the assumptions going back even to the Second Temple period, but also because they're all part of one society and they talk to each other and they have many of the same values. And so they develop similar systems and also similar institutions, and they're going in and out of the same spaces and building similar institutions. So there are certain differences. And one other difference that I noticed based on your own work was that there's no orphanage in the Jewish community in the early modern period. Orphans live in the home. So there are some differences which are really, really striking. The record keeping is one of them. And I think the Jews keep very, very copious records. I was surprised how detailed and meticulous the records were. But I do think there's contact between the officials all the time. And I saw this most clearly in Hamburg, where I would read a Jewish logbook with a bylaw, let's say, forbidding begging in the community with no reference to the Christian authorities. But when I went through the Senate records, I would see that just a couple of days prior, the Senate had met and had forbidden begging throughout the city. And then they sent a letter to the Jewish community informing them of that policy. And then the Jewish community implemented that policy and then thought about, okay, if begging isn't allowed, how are we going to support the beggars that are here? We'll do that within the synagogue structure. And so I think there is this channel back and forth, and that concept would have allowed for the development of very, very similar institutions. And I think part of what's interesting about this project is how similar Jewish charity is to other forms of German charity in the city.
Very interesting. So I'm going to move on to a question now that comes from Greg Gardner, who I will mention is doing, really, really interesting work on rabbinic sources in late antiquity in relationship to philanthropy and charity in that context. He also thanks you. He wants to focus on what united these different communities in their approach to charity. Did they exchange ideas and influence each other? It seems, I'm inferring that there's kind of a uniformity to this kind of system that you're describing. So much of the language ideas seem to touch back to traditional Jewish texts. So Greg is also wondering about what impact earlier Jewish texts and ideas may have had and how charity was put into action in these communities.
Thank you. That is an amazing question. So when I constructed this study, I studied 3 different communities. And the reason I studied 3 was in order to really get a sense of, is there uniformity across communities? So I chose a large community of Frankfurt, the largest community in the West, a smaller urban community of Worms. And those communities had in common that they were both in a Judengasse, despite their different sizes, and they both dated back to the Middle Ages. And I also selected Altona Hamburg-Wandsbek, which was a big community, but a new community and not in a Judengasse. And this was to avoid any binaries and try to really get a sense of how uniform the system was. And what I found was that the system was extremely uniform. Since the publication of the book, when I've looked at smaller rural communities, I've seen the same kind of system, just shrunken, a little bit different, but this is a very uniform approach. I think it has a lot to do with what I just said, that this is very similar to Christian forms of charity at the time. So I do think there is a uniformity. There are slight differences, the number of charity collectors or the number of funds or little tiny differences in how things were run, but in general, we see very, very similar process. Now, in terms of basing things in the rabbinic system, it's very interesting because there's no question that the terminology that they use is very deeply rooted in the rabbinic, in the classical literature. So they'll use words like tamhui or hekdesh to talk about charity funds, and they refer to these charity funds. And in that sense, they're very deeply aware of that tradition and use phrases from it, and certainly are aware of the Jewish legal aspects of charity and think about those things. So even in some of the descriptive custom books that talk about charity, they're quoting the Talmud, they're quoting the rabbis, they're quoting certain tractates that deal with these issues. And yet, I think it's very much an early modern institution, and they're using these terms and this language to talk about something that's really new, that's very urban, that's very early modern. And I would say that's really relevant for this larger community where you have a large number of poor. And I see that most clearly by comparing it to the Middle Ages, where we'll have some of these same terms, but that robust infrastructure and that systemic nature, and certainly that meticulous record keeping, it just doesn't exist. And I think there's something new happening here. And it's not surprising because there's something new happening with Christian charity too. But the deep sort of awareness of the theology of the phrases and the terms is unmistakable.
So the next set of questions are all equally fascinating. They come from Magdalena, and I think they're also interesting. I'm going to ask maybe the first two together and then the third one separately. So she asked first about the terminology and how is what you're describing different from, or how does it relate to quote unquote poor relief that often pops up in early modern scholarship. And then she's also asking about the relationship between what you're describing to Pidyon Shvuyim, which is collecting funds for enslaved and prisoners, the community collecting funds to save or redeem enslaved people or prisoners. How does that fit into this picture?
Okay, so I think we could use the term poor relief or charity here, perhaps interchangeably, and that might be something interesting to think about. Going back to Lila's first question about charity or philanthropy or poor relief, I think that's a term that would certainly work here. I chose the term charity because it's the translation of tzedakah, and that's the word we see in the sources. But I think poor relief would certainly be an apt phrase. In terms of ransoming captives, so I thought I'd see a lot more ransoming of captives than I did in my sources, because it's such a central theme in some of the Mediterranean sources, certainly Maimonides, and I'm thinking about Italy and funds for enslaved Jews in Italy. There we see, I think, much more in the sources. I did see some references to this in the German sources. Fewer captives than sometimes a woman who was seeking money for her husband who had been thrown into jail for not paying taxes. That's really where I see it more. But those references are scattered and few and far between. It was just not as prominent a theme as, let's say, what Mark Cohen has found for medieval Egypt, or what I would assume we would see in, let's say, early modern Italy. So that maybe is a surprising difference. It didn't appear as frequently in the records.
Interesting. So I'm going to ask now Magdalena's last question, which is about the role of doctors of medicine in this whole process. She says that they became instrumental in deciding health-related charity, I guess, in a later period. Do we find similar development in the Jewish community that employs physicians in your period?
So yes, the Jewish community does employ physicians. And it's not just physicians. They employ physicians, they employ nurses, they employ midwives. And some of them are obviously involved in caring for the poor. So this happened primarily in the space of the hospice, and there will be a doctor who receives a salary for a community, or a midwife who receives a salary from the community. And they will tend to people who come to the hospice, which would include sometimes the local ill. This is something that changes over time as well. So in a place like Frankfurt, just sort of as open in parentheses, the hospice opens initially as a place for physically and mentally disabled within the community, but very quickly, and certainly by the 18th century, local Jews do not go there for treatment, and only foreign Jews go there for treatment, but the community employs doctors and midwives to tend to the poor. They also have attendants within the hospice who do things like changing the linen, cooking the food, cleaning, and these are, like the gatekeeper I mentioned, communal employees who don't receive membership. They themselves are members of the laboring poor. So this is how the community supports them as well. So we definitely see that. And I'd say, I just remembered it from this wonderful question. I did find one example actually in a very interesting case brought before the council in Frankfurt, where a Jewish doctor came before the council and asked for a reduction in his tax rates because he said, I cared for the Christian poor for free, and therefore I'd like to reduce my taxes. And that's a really interesting event. Also, to go back to Tom's question about Jews and Christians and contact, there we have sort of interfaith charitable care happening, and it's happening with a doctor. So I definitely think doctors, midwives, the field of medicine is critical for understanding this care, especially in the place of the hospice. And there's also, just to throw this out, the role of confraternities once you get to the 18th century. In some of these communities, you'll have a very active confraternity funding the hospice or taking communal funding, running the hospice, giving it to the doctors, but overseeing and being active. So we have this sort of really neat intertwining of confraternal, voluntary, sort of pious activity, formal communal medical employees, and the communal leadership all in this one space. And I think that's really interesting and probably needs more research.
Very interesting. So our next question shifts the focus to language. Whether you see linguistic rule, or I guess a pattern in the terminology or the language that the texts are using when they use Hebrew, or are they using a mixture of Judeo-German or Yiddish or Hebrew? Did you attend to the kind of terminology or language that the sources are using?
Sure. It depends on the genre of sources. What I tried to do in this book was to use many different genres to sort of come at the question of public charity from many, many different perspectives. So for the communal logbooks or the Pinkasim, the language is a very idiosyncratic mix of Hebrew and Yiddish, which is common to these logbooks. It's more Yiddish than Hebrew, but it's absolutely a mix. When I read custom books, let's say a famous custom book of Yuspa Shamash of Worms, or the custom book that I showed here of Yuspa Han of Frankfurt, those are written in Hebrew with, just a little sprinkling of Aramaic, as you would expect in a custom book, or sometimes a little bit of Judeo-German in Yuspa when he's sort of telling us what people was said. That would be Yiddish. And of course, then there's the sources in German, which would be any correspondence between the government, the magistrates, the Senate, the council, whoever it may be, and the Jewish community. Those would be in German. But the logbooks themselves are mostly in Judeo-German and Hebrew. Although, let's say the headings of that charity logbook that were done by week is according to the weekly Torah portion. So yes, technically that's Hebrew, but that would have been used in Yiddish as well. I hope that answers the question, gives a sense of the genres.
So we have another question from Thomas that's taking us back to terminology. As we consider the changing terminologies and ideologies of quote unquote charity over time, he thinks it's important to recall both the immediate personal relationship between donor and recipient in traditional charity and the degree to which the provision of aid was voluntary or not. You mentioned both of those in your talk, and his question is whether they, not whether they changed, but why and to what extent.
So I'll start with the provision of voluntary versus, I don't want to say involuntary or mandatory charity. I think we see a lot more of this in the early modern period. And this is part of, I think, the general culture of regulation that we see in the period. So many regulations, so many bylaws. And this is a piece of that. And so part of that is donations to the charity fund or mandatory taxes to the charity fund, however we want to term those payments, or fines to the charity fund. I think that is new. And I think the reason that happens, and I think it happens to a very large extent, is because we have an influx of poor. We have larger communities. We have many refugees. We have a lot more migration and movement. We have in some of these cities like Frankfurt and Worms, a Judengasse with limited space and limited room for Jews, both physically and legally. And I think communities are just trying to create a system where they can cope with these migrating poor, with sort of waves of refugees, which are not just coming from the East, but I'm thinking of, let's say, the 9 Years' War. And then you have refugees from Worms coming to Frankfurt, and you have just a lot of movement from Mannheim, from Alsace, from all these different places into the city. And they have to cope with these larger communities, these waves of refugees. And the way they do that is through regulation, and that's tied to fines and mandatory charity. I still do think that we see that personal relationship between donor and recipient. And we see it in several ways, even in the public charity. I'll give just one example. I mentioned that in Altona and Hamburg, it was forbidden to go begging house to house. But then I had shown that page of the sexton where the sexton allowed people to get married once they paid their debts. In that same logbook, I found many examples in which the sexton said, okay, well, this poor person came, so we're going to make an exception and either allow someone else to beg house to house for them. these people would have had to stay either in a Jewish communal institution or with other Jewish neighbors. And sometimes the people on the poor relief rolls are relatives of Jews in these communities. And so it's really interesting. It wasn't always possible for me, just because of the way the names appear in the sources, to probe those personal relationships. But we are talking sometimes about people would have known, sometimes people's relatives. And I think when exceptions are made, they're sometimes made for a reason because of pregnancy, but they're sometimes made for a reason because somebody has that personal relationship. Now, because my study focused more on public charity, I didn't really delve into other kinds of charity like hospitality. But in more recent research that I've been doing, especially on Jewish women, I've been seeing many examples where Jewish women open their homes to house poor students, to take care of poor orphans, and founded confraternities to give care to people they knew. And I think there we are talking about that more personal relationship in a much more voluntary frame. And I think the book dealt more with that public frame that was perhaps with more distance, but that other kind of charity certainly remains in the community. And I think really warrants additional study.
So as our time draws to a close, I want to just slip in one last question just to kind of round out our understanding of this history. So, and maybe this goes beyond the period that you focused on, but how does this system come to an end? Is it emancipation? Is it survive beyond that? Where does this go in terms of the future of the Jewish community of Europe?
So I ended my study in 1750, but I can say a little bit about what comes next. When the Jewish communities are formally dissolved with emancipation or with other movements that dissolve official communities, it depends on each city when exactly that happened, at the very end of the 18th, but usually in the beginning of the 19th century, this formal infrastructure for mandatory fines and mandatory taxes disintegrates to some extent, because you don't have to be a member of a Jewish community anymore, or you can opt to be a member of a different Jewish community. And so once the framework of the traditional community disappears, this to some extent disappears along with it. And then we're left with this much more voluntary charity. We see a huge role for these benevolent societies. So that's sort of the continuous strand, where the benevolent societies that are founded in the late 16th, but especially the 17th and even more so the 18th century, burial societies and dowering bride societies and poor student societies, and it's a very important part of Jewish communal life. These societies continue as voluntary societies, and I would say they're brought even across the Atlantic, and there's been really interesting work done on how the German model of pious benevolent societies, which of course is not just a German model, but an Italian model, maybe even a medieval Spanish model, but this model then is brought also to America. And so I think there is that strand of continuity, but there is also a very big change, because a lot of the infrastructure that I'm talking about, it doesn't disappear, but it doesn't have the power and the control that it would have had during the period that I studied.
And is part of the story of emancipation a rejection of this system? How does the system fit into breaking away from?
I don't know if it's a rejection of this system, although in the late 18th century, you do see a reluctance of certain elite members of the community to serve in the capacity of communal officials. Lay leaders, which would include charity collectors. In some communities, being a charity collector is a stepping stone to being a lay leader. So this is a really, really big job. And as time goes on, some people are more loath to perform it. But I see it more as an after effect rather than a rejection of this specific system. I don't know, but that's my instinct. But I think we'd have to really go into those records of the very late 18th, beginning of the 19th century and see if something else happens. When I did go farther just to see if there was any large change, I didn't see anything, but you do sometimes see a reluctance. I mean, which I don't think is new to that period. Sometimes people don't want to pay taxes, they don't want to pay fines, and they don't want to contribute to the charitable fund, especially when they're told that they absolutely have to. So I think, there is that piece of it. Does that intensify? That's something that I think needs more research.
You've uncovered something so fascinating, Debra. So I want to thank you so much for sharing just a little bit of your research, and thank the audience for attending and for the great questions. And if anybody of you out there is interested in this larger initiative, you can find my email on our website, and please be in touch. We're trying to create a network of scholars who share an interest in philanthropy, and this talk demonstrates why. It's really, really fascinating and important history. So thank you again, Deborah. Thank you very much. And I wish you all a good afternoon or good evening.